McClelland here, and welcome to another series in the Story Seller series of videos based on my book, Shift and Disrupt, Stop Selling Widgets, Start Selling Wisdom. And in today's episode, I want to take you through the 9 story modes that actually make up the story selling philosophy. These are the 9 story modes that form the chapters within my book. Now, in the past videos, we have looked at the 3 different types of stories that form the story selling philosophy. And we've also looked at the 3 different personas that make up the story seller. So just as a recap, before we dive into today, we have the internal stories. Now, they are the stories we all tell ourselves about the buyer. It could be the deal, it could be the price, it could be the competitor, but they're the internal stories that we tell ourselves. And the persona that's necessary here is that of story catcher. Because if we really want to be high performing, if we really want to dominate our market and be the #1 pick out there, we have got to nail the internal stories. Secondly are the external stories, and they are the stories we actually tell our buyer. And this is the persona of storyteller. And third are the essential stories. Now, these are the stories we must elicit from our buyer. And these are the stories that are so often missed. So we need to step into the persona of story seeker. So what I want to do today is just to very, very briefly go through each of the 3 stories in each category and give you an overview of those, because the next 9 videos will be breaking these apart. So let's have a look at the first story in the internal stories that we need to nail, the stories that we tell ourselves. And first and foremost is our identity. And so from our identity perspective, it's like, okay, what are those? Are we comfortable being okay with all the different parts of us? So yes, there's a little bit of strategic woo-woo in here, because we need to get very, very clear on who's actually driving the bus. Is it the adult or is it our child? And so we get very clear on how our identity impacts us in our business environment. Secondly, because this impacts now onto the next story, and the next story is that of authority. And so from an authority perspective, how do you relate to the people that make the decisions out there? And how do you build your credibility when it's needed at that C level, at that high decision-making level? How do you react, and how do you process people in authority? Third, which is so critical, and which so many of us have kind of grown up in environments where money is a big impact. So how do you express your value out there in the marketplace? How do you convert opportunities so that you can increase revenue and increase margin? And how we do that has a lot to do with our stories that we're telling ourselves around what money means. So the internal stories, the stories that we've got to catch, are those 3. And so with all my experience out there in the marketplace, whether it's with Tony Robbins coaching his clients, whether it's corporate Australia, whoever it may be, entrepreneurs, startups, this has got to be nailed. So then we move on to the second column here, which are the external stories. What are the stories that we actually tell our buyers? Now, we can definitely go down the path of connection story and an influence story and success story and company story. All of those are wonderful, and they're super important that you nail them. But as you know, Shift and Disrupt, my new book, is based around mental models as part of a way to go to market. And so one of the first stories that we need to be able to show and tell, not just tell, is how do we guide our buyers through change? So what is the progression model that will help us to reduce buyer resistance and increase buyer acceptance? Now, this, what I'm doing here with you right now, is an example of a progression model. It's an example of, a model that is showing a path that you can go down. So it doesn't have to be as, kind of like detailed as this, but how do you do that with your buyer to help them guide change within their organization as well as with them? The second story that we need to nail from an external perspective story is the tension model. So how is it that we can build intensity in the conversation so that our buyer buys the whole concept of change? So whilst that might be the why behind change, this is the what. And when you can build a tension model and collaborate with your buyer on what needs to change, you're almost there. And finally, our third story that we need to be able to show and tell is an integration story. So once you understand the why, and so do they, and everybody understands what needs to change, then this is the how. And so how do you, I guess, articulate your outcome and explain what it is that you do with the buyer at the heart of all of this? So there are three external stories, and they're the stories that you need to learn to put into your, tool belt so that you can deepen your conversations with your buyers. And how we do that even more is through the essential stories. And these are the stories that you need to seek from your buyer. And the first essential story is, how do you expand your conversations? How do you show flexibility in your conversations? How do you expand the depth of your conversations so that you can begin to build buyer advocacy? The next one is all around perspective. And so when you adopt our coach approach, you learn that the ability for you to be able to, identify criteria from both an emotional basis, definitely, and a logical basis. So we bring together there the tools that really help your buyer, and you elicit from your buyer as what really matters to them. And finally, the final story that we need to elicit from our buyer is that of decision. And this is for us to land the business. So when we talk about, decision, it's how do you, it's more than just, when are you going to make your decision, or what's involved in this decision, or, who's involved in the decision. We need to be able to win more business, and we need to be able to future-proof our business. And so when you understand those stories behind the stories, you're not going to get your buyer wrote stories. You're going to get their real stories. So I wanted to share that with you. In the next 9 videos, as I said, I'm going to be breaking each of these apart, but this forms the basis also of my new book, Shift and Disrupt. Stop selling widgets, start selling wisdom. So I would encourage you to follow me on LinkedIn, ring that bell, or follow my newsletter, follow definitely on YouTube at The Story Seller, and go to www.shiftanddisrupt.com and join us there for everything Shift and Disrupt and Story Seller basis. So on that note, have an amazing day, and we'll see you in the next video.